Well, thank you for having me. This is exciting for me to have an opportunity, not only to be involved with Calvary Chapel, which has been sort of a love of mine for many, many years, but to bring to the table a little bit of the flavor of some of my past. I grew up in a Christian home, and like a lot of people, I had that period when I was a young man that I started to wonder, what was this all about, and what would have happened had I grown up in another country, and what if my parents had not been Christians? And I began to ask myself a lot of questions, and so it was interesting that when I really got serious about the Lord when I was 20, and I began to really start doing a lot of research, that years later I would go into law enforcement, and the natural tendency that I had to ask a lot of questions, to investigate, played into what was the career that I had for over 13 years. I worked for about 7 years in patrol and another 7 years as a police detective, and eventually served on the major crimes team for Washington County, Oregon, which was a team that did most of the officer-involved shootings and the homicides in the Washington County area, Clackamas County, that area there. And our team would go out on most of those major cases and assist the other departments. And so it was really kind of a nice privilege to get a chance to work on those cases. But about 50% of my caseload during those years was child abuse, because there's just so much reporting of child abuse that all person crime detectives usually have to carry a caseload and work through that. So I did those, and I did a lot of robbery cases and just anything else that kind of came down the pipe in terms of assaults and things like that. But in the course of time, I worked a lot of different kinds of cases, and I fine-tuned some of my instincts in terms of using logic and the rules of evidence. And as I came back to studying the Scriptures, it was amazing to me just how useful those were in terms of trying to seek out which was the correct worldview to follow. And I'm going to share a little bit about some of my reasoning with you tonight as I go through this. So I hope you'll enjoy some of this. It is based, to some degree, on the trial of Jesus, but we're not going to pick apart the trial of Jesus. It's been done quite a bit, and you can read it. It's obviously in all four of the Gospels, slightly different storylines as they go through it. They give a little bit different details, but the story is there. But we're gonna highlight some things maybe that you haven't heard of before or haven't seen before. But as we start out tonight, what I want to do is just stop for a minute and look you square in the eye and say, are you ready to listen to the truth tonight? Are you ready? Do you want to know the truth? Do you hunger for the truth? Is truth something that you really, really want? If not, you probably won't hear a lot of what I have to say. But if it is, if it's something that you want both in your mind and your heart, and it has to be both at the same time, then you really can receive something tonight, I guarantee you. I ran across a scripture that I want to read to you. It's something Jesus said, okay? He said this in Matthew 7, chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. He said, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the road is broad, that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. How narrow is the gate, and difficult the road that leads to life, and few that find it." And then in the next verse he says, "Beware the false prophets who come in sheep's clothing." Now, here's the question to you tonight, and I hope you carry this through my entire talk. Was that a true statement that Jesus made? Or was it just something that we can kind of wash away as if it doesn't matter? Because I don't know about you, but I get stopped cold every time I read that verse, because when at the very end it says, "And few there are that find it." I don't want to hear that. Because to me, the truth should be something easily embraced by a lot of people. Why is it so hard for so many people to see and understand the truth? And that's a question that I've been seeking the answer for many years, but I don't really know. Obviously, what else Jesus says about this sort of darkness that can encompass the mind must be true as well, if in fact a majority of people don't recognize the truth right when they see it. But I'm going to ask you tonight, hopefully, to open up your minds and think about some of the things that I have to say. You know, whether we think about our life as broken or as perfect, as fulfilling or as empty, we still need Jesus. A lot of pastors make a mistake a lot of times of thinking that they can only present Jesus to people who are broken. But there's a lot of people in the world that have no sense in which their lives are broken. In fact, in many ways, their lives feel very successful. It seems like they have quite a good handle on things. I have a neighbor of mine who, I'm telling you, this guy can do anything. I watch him from across the street from my front porch, and he can fix and repair and just do just about anything. He seems to be the most self-sufficient guy I've ever seen. But I have a feeling that maybe there's not something perfectly right about his life. But if you asked him, he might tell you that nothing seems to be amiss. So we have to be careful about thinking that Jesus is going to swoop in at all times and simply correct a life that's gone astray, because it's not always quite that simple. And the truth is the truth no matter how a person's life is reflected in this world. So we want to seek out our truth as we're looking at it with some logic. Bring up this next photo here of the crucifixion of Jesus here. This shows that the crucifixion of Jesus, according to the scriptures, is almost a multi-dimensional kind of occurrence. It's a little bit more multi-dimensional than a lot of us take into consideration. We don't realize just the gravity of what's happening. You know, it's funny, I heard this story. There was a little boy who was sitting on the front row of his church when they were having an Easter pageant. And one of the characters in the pageant said, "The king is coming." And the little boy jumped up and he said, "So that's Elvis?" When he saw the guy in the back. He was surprised. He was confused. He had a misperception, didn't he? He didn't really understand who Jesus was. And what happens is a lot of times is folks get confused about what it is we're talking about. So hopefully today we're going to buckle up. We're going to go kind of fast, but you're going to get a good picture about who Jesus really is. When I was a young man, I began to ask some questions. And over time, I put together an acronym to label these questions. And you'll see in this slide, I call them the BIPEDS questions. BIPED stands for beginnings, identity, purpose, ethics, destiny, and solution to suffering and sin. I put all the major questions of life under those categories right there. And it's not hard to imagine what they mean. They mean, who am I? Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going when I die? What's right or wrong in the world? What's good or bad? What's the purpose of life? You see, Christianity is a community of people living within a framework of 4 to 6 answers in a world of people living without them. That's what's distinct about Christianity, is Christianity has answers to all of these questions. And if you want to really quickly think about a lot of the other world's religions, I challenge you to find consistent, coherent, congruent answers to all of those questions in any other world religion and atheism. They aren't there. I've looked. So it's a unique thing about Christianity. It has coherence. Whereas other religions that don't have a complete answer to each one of those that fits together in a nice puzzle, they have chaos. Chaos reigns even if they don't recognize it. You see, in order to have answers to these questions, though, we need to have a source for those answers. Now, if you went out and interviewed people on the street, they would probably give you a few answers to some of these. Sometimes they might be a little bit stone-faced, but a lot of times they'll give you some sort of a haphazard answer. But what they don't realize is there's limits to our abilities to answer some of these questions, especially the one that happens at the end, our destiny. What happens to us when we die? And it's tough to know our limitations. When I was a young patrol officer, and I was just getting out on the street, and I'd gone through training. I'd been through the San Diego Police Academy. I'd been through the Oregon Police Academy, and I was in great shape. I was 29 years old, and I was ready to go. And I had already done a couple of pretty unique things out on the street. And so now I was out on my own. I was in my district down in South Beaverton, Oregon. And all of a sudden, I got a call of a guy breaking into a car. And I went rolling up on this guy pretty fast. I had my lights all darkened out on my car. And just as he caught wind of me coming around the corner, he jumped out of that car that he was trying to get the stereo out of, and he took off running. Now, one of the things I learned really early on, the secret for police officers to catch these guys, even though we're wearing all this heavy gear, about 25 pounds of gear, is adrenaline. Adrenaline is our greatest friend because it helps me a little bit, and it hurts the bad guy. Because too much adrenaline, when the person gets flushed with it, when they run about 100 yards, they feel like they just ran 2 miles. And they're just puffing, and they can't believe they've only run 100 yards because they really just think they're completely out of breath. They just haven't breathed that whole time. The adrenaline's been pumping. So as a police officer, you kind of learn to control your emotions, control your adrenaline. So I knew I could catch this guy. So I took off after him, but he was one of these young kids who'd been around the cops in the neighborhood for quite a while. And he was used to running from the cops. And he was, the best thing I can describe him as is Tigger. You remember Tigger? He had the little springs on his feet. Well, I'm chasing this guy, and we kind of went through this gate into the backyard of this really nice neighborhood home. And as we got through there, I think, okay, I got him cornered now. And he comes up to this 6-foot fence, and it's just like Mr. Spring Tigger. He just sprung right up to the top of that thing and right over. And I'm like, okay, all right, it's on now. All right, he's not getting away. So I come running as fast as I can across that yard. And in my confidence, I came right at that thing, and I thought, okay, there's that cross member thing right there where you can put your foot on, and I'm just going to jump for that thing. But what I didn't really realize was with all that weight, and as tired as I was, I went to jump, and I only got about 2 inches off the ground. But I was running hard, and I hit that fence flat on. You ever seen those Looney Tunes cartoons where they hit it and their whole body goes right through the fence? Well, unfortunately, that doesn't happen in reality. What happens is when you're carrying all this weight and all this gear, big gun and all that stuff, and you hit fence that hard, you snap the entire section of the fence off and flatten it, just like that. So there I am laying on the ground. I've knocked over an 8-foot section of this heavy-duty fence, and I can see the lights flickering on upstairs in the house, right? The people that had hired me to protect them, and I had just smashed down their fence. My sergeant wasn't too happy about that because that kid got away that night. We didn't catch him for several nights later. But anyway, what I learned that night and from that story is that we have limitations. There's limitations that we have to be aware of. And we have limitations not only in our physical abilities, but we have limitations in our knowledge. And unless we come to grips with that limitation and humble ourselves to recognize that we need a source of authority to tell us the answers to these questions that's outside of ourselves, that's what we call revelation truth. It's not just something that can always be found through scientific method, but it's a revelation because science is not going to tell us what happens to us when we die. It's just not going to do it. But Jesus gives us an answer to that. You know, one of the things that happens to folks when they think they know something and they're wrong is they get a case of something that we call insanity. Now, when I was a young cop, in San Diego for a year, I ran into a lot of really interesting things very, very quickly down there in San Diego. There's a lot of it in Colorado Springs as well, but down there was quite a bit. When my very first week on the job, I remember my partner and I were out, and we went on a call, and when we came back from our call, there was a guy who was sitting on top of our patrol car. And I don't mean on the hood. He was on the top of the patrol car where the bubble lights were at that time. We had the old bubble lights, right? And he's up there, and he's playing like he's playing the bongo drums on our bubble lights. And he just thought that was the funniest thing in the world. And he said, I think what he was saying was that he was a leprechaun. And he thought that we couldn't see him because he was a leprechaun. Well, back in those days, we used to carry these things called a PR-24 baton. Now, nowadays, you play these extendable batons. But in the old days, a PR-24, it formed like an L shape, so you could hold it like this and spin around. Well, my partner learned a long time ago that the best way to use a PR-24 was not how they instructed you, but was to turn it around so that it became a hook. And he caught this kid just as he was saying, "You can't see me, you can't see me," and he just swiped like this around his ankles and just dropped him onto the hood, grabbed his foot, jerked him off there, and had him in handcuffs in the back of the car in about 10 seconds, just like that. But that kid was insane. He had a false view of reality, didn't he? Now, whether it be sickness or intentional or what it was insanity. And sometimes we have to understand that when we think about reality and understanding what reality really is and a consistent view of reality, that when we don't hold that, we are in essence insane. Had another gal, one time we had to pick up off the street. She got in the back of our patrol car, flipped her body upside down, put her feet on the ceiling. She was handcuffed. She was pretty bendable. And she started bouncing her feet around like she was dancing, and she kept saying, "I'm a white rabbit, I'm a white rabbit." Okay? Now, of course, we had to take her somewhere to get taken care of. She was suffering from insanity, a false view of reality. Well, let me ask you something. What do you think Jesus has to say about reality? There's a lot of things Jesus says about reality, but I'm just going to go over a couple for you. There's a slide here. Jesus defined the character and attributes of God, the universe, man, reality, and eternity. Jesus indicated we are a special creation of God, but separated from him due to our sin. Jesus said our greatest deeds, good deeds, are still unlike or just like dirty rags in God's eyes. Jesus mentioned that eternal separation from God awaits all of us. That's what he calls damnation if we don't take care of this problem called sin. Jesus says that despite this, God loves us and seeks to provide a solution for us. Jesus says that pride and haughtiness dominate, while humbleness is necessary for us to live. And Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by me." He also says that verse I read to you earlier about the way being broad that leads to destruction. And he says, come to me and I'll give you living water. He confirmed that our purpose, the why we were here and brought on this earth, was to glorify God, to know God, to show his kindness, and to do good works. And Jesus said that he would be killed and then rise from the dead. Jesus said, you brood of vipers, to the Pharisees who distorted God's law, his truth. And they plotted to kill Jesus, and Jesus told us that he knew that, and that he was going to be arrested, that they were lying, these people, that they were abusing, and they were going to lynch him, and that 3 days later, you know what happens. And then his followers dramatically changed immediately after, claiming that they saw him alive. Now, those people who follow and believe this believe a view of reality that Jesus puts forth. If, in fact, that view of reality is true, then all opposing views, in a sense, is like a form of insanity. I remember when we went to arrest a guy one time, and we put handcuffs on him. And he was really upset. He said, you can't arrest me. He just didn't feel it was right to be arrested, even though he'd committed a pretty serious crime. He said, you can't arrest me. And I said, really? I said, well, you have handcuffs on you. Well, you can't take me anywhere. You can't arrest me. You can't take me anywhere. At that time, there were 6 police officers who were standing around him. And I could tell you that he honestly believed that we could not arrest him, even though he was looking at 6 very large police officers who 10 seconds later launched him like a missile into the back of the police car. But in his view, he thought that we really couldn't do it. There was something in him that just could not accept that reality. Now, we've seen this in a modern day with the Nazi regime. Remember the Nazis? Jerry Adler writes, its elaborate mechanisms for transporting, selecting, murdering, and incinerating thousands of people a day constitute a kind of industrialized death. You remember that? Well, you know what? There's crazy stuff like this going on all around the world right now. We are hearing an increase in the amount of terrorist activities every single day now. They're just flowing in. It's getting faster and faster and faster. We shouldn't be surprised that people have a view of reality that causes them to believe that behavior like this is appropriate. They actually think that they're doing the right thing. So are they right or are they wrong? Somehow we have to take a stand and say, you're holding a false view of reality. This idea that you have that this is correct. Now, I know a lot of you out here kind of know the scriptures fairly well. I can see that there's probably only a few people here I don't know too well. But regardless, tonight, I'm going to talk on a pretty basic level, okay? I'm going to back up. I'm going to give us a little running start, a little background on what we're talking about here. Because I want you to see what the central theme of the scriptures are and where we're going. The Old Testament is an account of a nation, and the New Testament is an account of a man. The Creator became a man. His appearance is the central event of all history. He died to purchase us and is alive now. The most exalted privilege is to know him, and that's what the Bible is all about. It all started when God created the world and created man, and man was his special creation. But man right away struggled with the view of reality that God revealed to him and began to doubt that view of reality. And when man doubted reality as God had put forth to him, he sinned and rebelled against God and fell. And then God's love kicked in, and God came up with a rescue operation plan. The Bible is a lot about this rescue operation plan that God puts in motion. Now, one of our struggles that we have with God, especially when it concerns suffering, is his timing. When we don't understand why things aren't happening when we think they should happen, it's usually because we just don't understand God's timing. That's a lot about what it is. When people ask us about suffering, I don't know how a good God could do such and such. Really, they're struggling with timing because God is going to take care of evil and suffering someday, just in his proper timing, as he reveals to us. Now, one of the unique things about Christianity is that God reveals himself and his purposes and his reality through history. Other religions don't do that. They'll often tell you facts, figures, moral things that they want you to adhere to, but they don't tie their revelation to history the way God does. And there's a reason why God ties it to history. There's a reason why the Bible is so big, because it's documenting all of this history where God intervenes in mankind. And he's doing it for a purpose, because he wants to leave footprints so that we can see and verify who it is that's speaking to us. It's very important in God's eyes that we have a correct view about reality and that we know it's him telling it to us. So God's delicate, integrated message system is set up so that he does not overwhelm our free will. That's another thing. See, we don't understand his timing, and we don't understand one of his greatest goals. One of God's greatest goals is that we don't be pressured into serving or loving him, because he knows that love has to be a free will choice. So how does he delicately reveal himself and help us to come back to reality and provide a solution for our sin, while at the same time maintaining our free choice so he doesn't overwhelm that? And this is what's documented in the scriptures. There are a lot of people that are coming along these days. A lot of college students are getting hit in the seminaries and over here at the college campuses, telling them that the Bible's been corrupted, that it's not what was originally written. And unfortunately, this isn't a class or a message where I can go and delve into that. But I can tell you that a lot of that information that they're getting hit with is mythological. It's just simply not valid information. But tonight what we're going to look at is some footprints of what we call the footprints of the Messiah, or the prophecies of the coming one. And you'll see here quickly in the next slide that in the Bible there are 8,362 predictive verses. No other religion in the world has anything even remotely close to this. There are over 1,817 predictions, 737 separate matters, as documented by J. Barton Payne in the Encyclopedia of Biblical Prophecy. That's a lot of different things. And built into these prophecies, right, to give us a sense that it's God who's speaking, is his rescue plan. So I'm going to go over a few of these prophecies really fast that lead up, that are rooted in history, okay? You see, when God decides that he's going to send a Savior, he says he's going to send it into history. This Savior is going to come into history, and so he ties the Savior's lineage into history so that we can know when the Savior arrives. Some of the prophecies that come in the Old Testament that are unfolded says that this Savior will be born of the seed of Abraham. He'll then be born of the seed of Isaac, the seed of Jacob, and of the tribe of Judah. Now, if you've ever studied the Old Testament, you'll realize that at some point along the line, God reveals himself to Abraham and says, I'm going to use you to set up a nation, and I'm going to do some special things with. And then his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and eventually one of Jacob's sons, Judah. And then God then narrows it down even further and says that the Messiah will come through the descendant of the line of Jesse, one of Judah's descendants. And then further, he says it will be of David's family. And David was the great king of Israel, who was from that same line. And as he narrows it down further and further, as you read the scriptures, you can see that there's an enemy of God that's trying to stop this promised Messiah from arriving. That's part of the storyline. It's pretty interesting to see all the things that this spiritual enemy goes to try and destroy. And we'll get to that story a little bit where the Bethlehem children are all killed by Herod. Why was that happening? They were trying to, probably fostered by spiritual forces, destroy all those children to possibly kill the Messiah when the Messiah was young. But it failed. It says here the Messiah would be born of a virgin, be a firstborn son, be born in the city of Bethlehem, that he would soldier in Egypt, that he would live in Galilee and come out of Nazareth, that he would be announced with an Elijah-like herald that would be John the Baptist, that it would occasion the massacre of the Bethlehem children, that he would proclaim a jubilee to the world. His mission would include not only to the Jewish people, but also to the Gentiles. And one of the most important things that his ministry would be one of healing and miracles. And he would teach in parables as well. He would be disbelieved and rejected by the rulers. He would make a triumphal entry into Jerusalem, just what Pastor Chaz was talking about last week. And he would be smitten. He'd be a smitten shepherd, betrayed by a friend for 30 pieces of silver. Plus, many, many more prophecies that I'm not going to go over tonight concerning the crucifixion. You remember John the Baptist, when John the Baptist was in prison, if you've ever read the story? And you see, he went out 6 months ahead of Jesus, and he's announcing the coming of the Messiah, right? And then as Jesus begins to rise in prominence, Herod, who's kind of an evil king of that area, he has John the Baptist picked up and thrown in prison. And in a little bit, he's going to cut John the Baptist's head off. But while John the Baptist is languishing in prison, Jesus is out there doing some pretty amazing things. And finally, John the Baptist starts to doubt, just like I've doubted a lot of times. Like, wait a minute, God, I thought you were going to do this. I thought this was going to happen. Did I get this wrong? And John the Baptist says, maybe I missed something. Are you really the one? And that's a question that we might ask, right? I don't know about you, but when I read that story, that is me asking that question. Are you really the one? Did I get this right? I put a lot of time and energy into figuring this out. I got to make sure. I only have a few more years. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think I have that many more years left. I want to make sure I get it right, just like John the Baptist. And so they went to Jesus, and Jesus gave them a message back to John the Baptist. And this is what he said. In Luke 7, verse 22, he says, "Go and report to John the things you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, those with skin diseases are healed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor are told the good news. And anyone who is not offended because of me is blessed." You know what he really said to John? John, what are the odds? What are the odds all those things would be happening right now if I wasn't who you know I am? That's what he was saying. And I want to talk to you about odds. On this next slide, it says composite probabilities. And I'm not going to explain to you how composite probabilities, there's probably a mathematical major in here who knows how this works. But let me just tell you that it's a kind of a complicated thing and how they decide what the probabilities are. On the next slide, it says there are 8 prophecies, and the mathematical probability of these, just 8 of those prophecies that I read to you would be true, is 1 to 10 in the 28th power. Now that's a pretty big number. And that's just 8. There's over 100 to 300 different specific prophecies about the coming of the Messiah. Just taking that 1 to the 10 to the 28th power is like covering the state of Texas with silver dollars 2 feet deep. Some of you have heard this before. It's a great analogy. Why change a perfect analogy? Imagine how big Texas is, bigger than Colorado, 2 feet deep, and taking a blind man and sending him out and spinning him around, letting him walk around the state of Texas for a couple of weeks. And sometime during that week, he's going to reach his hand into that stack of silver dollars. And only one of those silver dollars has a red X painted on it. But he's going to be blindfolded. He won't even know. He won't even be able to look down. And what are the odds that he would pick the right silver dollar? Pretty slim. And yet that's only 8. If you look at 48 prophecies, it's 1 in 10 to the 157th power. And mathematicians will say that that's the point at which we reach statistical impossibility. It's interesting that that is the same statistical impossibility that they calculate for evolution. Evolution's statistically impossible mathematically, according to what we know about DNA now. So it's the same as any chance that someone who was not the Messiah would have fulfilled those prophecies. The fact that Jesus fulfilled them all is amazing that people haven't noticed it. So let's get back to our religious history a little bit. Because as we went along and there was this nation established, God put some priests in a position in which that he would deliver them the law through Moses, and it would be what they would use to govern the people, right? But over the years, the people disobeyed the law, and they went off into captivity, and then they came back to the land, and they were overwhelmed by several empires. The Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, and the Roman Empire. And these religious leaders begin to compromise and learn how to work within the confines of an overwhelming and overarching imperial power like Rome. But they begin to figure out ways to make it work for them, to find ways they could still be successful and hold on to some of their power and operate. All it took was being a bit of a hypocrite and twisting and creating a few different laws. And that's what they did along the way until Jesus one day shows up and starts calling them to task for the burdens that they put on the people. And they're so wrapped up in holding on to their power and authority that they miss the arrival. And Pastor Chaz did a great job of talking about this last week. But if you don't mind, Pastor, I'm going to talk about it just a little bit more. Because on this next slide it says the most amazing prophecies are the ones I just read to you about his genealogy and the messianic prophecies, but there's one that's really cool. And Pastor Chaz was talking about Daniel 9, verses 24 through 25. And I'm not only going to go through the top part of it here real again because I got a really neat slide for you to look at. It says in 9:25, "Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the King shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and the streets shall be built again and the wall even in turbulent times." Now you see, they were gone in captivity and their city had been destroyed. But they were allowed finally to return and a king finally made an edict to say that they would be allowed to rebuild the city. It's recorded in the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, chapter 2. In fact, if you look on this next slide, it shows that happened under the rulership of Anaxarchus Longimanus on March 14th, 445 BC. And it says if you calculate those weeks, you see those weeks are really 7 years. Each week is 7 years. And if you multiply 69 times 7 years, it's 483 years. And back then they had a calendar of 360 days per year. It comes out to 173,880 days. If you do the calculation, as Pastor Chaz says, it comes out to April 6th, 32 AD. That's some pretty impressive precision. Now, Sir Robert Anderson, who, by the way, was a Scotland Yard detective back in the 1800s. So I'm pretty proud of him. And I have a copy of his book in my library called The Coming Prince, in which he does a lot of these calculations to help us understand this. And he points out that what's really interesting is that right in between, in the middle of these years, where you see that LXX, that stands for the Septuagint. Back in the day, back in Alexandria, Egypt, they made a translation of the Hebrew Bible into the common Greek language. And so in 270 BC, this translation of the Old Testament and all of these prophecies came out in black and white for a lot of the common people who could read that common Greek language to know and see. And they know that translation was made. It's pretty bulletproof demonstration that these prophecies were real. They were not written or created later or after the fact, many years before Jesus arrived. But when Jesus shows up in Luke chapter 19, verse 41 and 42, he comes over the hill and he comes riding into the city on a donkey, a small colt, right? And he weeps over it. And he says, "If thou hast known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong unto thy peace, and now are hidden from thine eyes." That is a very sobering thing. First, they should have known the day. Second, he holds them accountable to know the day. And then he says, and now they're hidden from your eyes. There can be a darkness that comes over us if we turn our back on the day in which God is saying, this is the day for you. This is your day to make a choice. Don't ever turn your back on the day that Jesus begins to reveal himself to you. Because they did not know the time of the visitation when it happened. It's pretty sad considering how much information they had available to them. And what's really cool is the timing of all of these things that happen. And this is what I'm hoping you get out of tonight as we move. I know I'm getting to the trial, I promise. But as we head into this, right? Now Jesus is in the city, and he's been there for a few days, right? And when he comes in, the Jews that are there that have been plotting, they've been plotting to nab him for some time now. And now it's like he's walking right into their trap. He's come down from Galilee, and he's come down to Jerusalem where all these religious leaders are. And they're excited because they're going to get their opportunity. But you know what? They're really afraid because the Romans have told them, look, you can do whatever you do, but you better keep it orderly. Because it was really important to the Romans that things did not turn chaotic, that there weren't riots. And it was always tempting for there to be riots. If you look through history, there was a lot of riots on those feast days and during those holidays. So these religious leaders said, look, we're not going to do this on a holiday. We're going to nab Jesus, but it's not going to happen on a high feast day because that would cause too much problems with the crowds and things like that. And the report card for the procurator, who was Pilate at the time, was how well he kept the peace in the city. That's what went back to Emperor Tiberius, was how well Pontius Pilate kept the peace. So they're making these plans, right? And they set it up with Judas for the 30 pieces of silver. And then we come to the Last Supper, right? And then Jesus does this strange thing. He turns to Judas and he says, "What thou doest quickly." You see, Jesus foiled their timetable. He had them put in a position where he had to fish or cut bait, basically. Judas had to move up the timetable or he had to abandon the whole idea. Who's in control here? Who's calling the shots? Jesus is. He has a precise timetable that he's orchestrating as he fulfills this. And when he gets into the garden, Judas goes away and then he brings back the soldiers. And the soldiers come walking up and Jesus says to them, "Whom seek ye?" And when he says, and they say, "Jesus of Nazareth," and he says, I am. And what happens to them? They fall flat, right? Right. And then, like idiots, I don't know why, they ask the question again, don't they? But I think the next time, they were probably holding on to something about then, right? And thankfully, Jesus says it differently the second time around. I bet they were just holding on for life after that. But who's in control of this whole situation? Because it's Jesus that says, let these, to his disciples, let these go their way. And the soldiers do it. They're obeying him. He's telling them when they're going to arrest him. He's in complete control. He's surrendering himself according to a timetable. He's in charge. Don't ever let that slip from your mind when you think about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So they grab him and they bring him real fast. And basically the trial of Jesus is 6 mini trials. It's a trial before Annas, the high priest, and Caiaphas. Annas is his father-in-law, and there was a kind of a dispute over who was supposed to be the high priest. We're not going to get into that. But also the Sanhedrin, the ruling body of the Jews, as they brought him before in the nighttime. And let me just say right up front, although we're calling this a trial, this is in no way a trial. This was a lynching. That's what it was. They grabbed Jesus and they lynched him basically. And they motivated the crowd to do it. And after they got done, they had to send Jesus over from the Sanhedrin over to Pilate, who was the Roman ruler, who dumped him off on Herod for a little bit, who brought him back to Pilate. So we had 6 little mini trials. And you can see that this area on the next slide is a picture of Pilate and Jesus in the judgment hall. That's what it was. You see, when they brought him and dumped him off there for Pilate, they couldn't go inside because they wouldn't want to get defiled for the Passover. So they had to leave Jesus there at the door, and then Pilate brought him into the judgment hall. What I want to show you, though, are some things that a lot of people miss. According to the laws that the Jews had that they'd received from Moses, there were very specific and strict ways in which they were supposed to hold a trial. They violated and committed a lot of illegalities in holding this trial, and I'm going to read them to you. The binding of a prisoner before he was condemned was illegal. Judges participated in the actual arrest of the accused. No legal transactions, including a trial, could be conducted at night. While an acquittal could be pronounced the same day, any other verdict required a majority of 2 and had to come on a subsequent day. In a Jewish court, the accused was to be assumed innocent until proven guilty by 2 or more witnesses. So we see when he was with the high priest and the religious leaders in the Sanhedrin, they were doing all these things illegally. It was illegal to conduct a session of the court on a feast day. The sentence is finally passed in the palace of the high priest, but the law demanded it be pronounced in the temple in the hall of hewn stone. The high priest rends his garment, but he was never permitted to tear his official robe, according to Leviticus chapter 21. Without his priestly robe, he couldn't have put Christ under oath. The use of violence during the trial, where they were beating Jesus, even they were allowing the soldiers to beat Jesus when the Sanhedrin had him, was apparently unopposed by these judges. And even in today's courts, where I was a police detective, I was under strict guidelines on how we could conduct a trial and the ways that I could bring evidence in. No prisoner could be convicted of his own evidence. And what that means, like, and this came to play for me a lot of times. A lot of times I would get a hint of a situation in a child abuse. And I was pretty good at working with folks who committed those kinds of crimes. I could get people to tell me the truth. There were times I even had somebody tell me the truth when I did not have yet what they call a disclosure. A disclosure is what a young child will do when it tells you a piece of information about being either sexually or physically abused. Well, because of things that I would find out, it really wouldn't act as corroborating evidence, and I would have a confession from a suspect, but not a disclosure from a young person yet. Well, somehow I could not just simply take that person to trial. I had to have cross-corroboration in order to substantiate what this confession was, just in case the person might be insane, right? So we had rules on how we had to do that. No person could be simply convicted on their own testimony of evidence. It was also the duty of a judge to see that the interests of the accused were fully protected. That's what judges' roles are. This wasn't like that. This was nothing but a kangaroo court, headed up especially by Pilate, who we'll get into in a minute. No witness was ever called for the defense. In fact, Jesus was never given a defense attorney to represent him or anybody to help and call witnesses for him. He wasn't even given a chance. Now, he could have spoken on his own behalf, but think of how many witnesses that could have been called for the case against Jesus. But we all know, before we go any further, that Jesus was both guilty and innocent and guilty at the same time, wasn't he? Because what was it they were accusing Jesus for that they wanted to give him the death penalty? Blasphemy. And what's blasphemy? In this case, it was basically calling himself Messiah and God. Jesus was one of the few people in the history of the world to ever be crucified and killed, not for what he had done, but for who he claimed to be. So did he commit the crime of blasphemy? Yes, so he was guilty. But was he guilty of blasphemy? No, because he was God. So an interesting kind of a quagmire there. But finally, then, one of the more important points is that this civil court that the Sanhedrin and the high priest ran were not allowed to give Jesus the death penalty. That authority, that civil authority, had been removed from them, which is interesting. It's just a little aside, but I think it's important to know. In Genesis chapter 49, let's go all the way back to the first book of the Bible, and Jacob pronounces this prophecy. He says, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come," Shiloh the Messiah, "and unto him shall the gathering of his people be." You see, the scepter was the ruling scepter, and they associated it with being able to give the death penalty verdict, which in those days was stoning. And they always had that. It's interesting that all the empires that rule over the Jews during that time, from the Babylonians to the Medo-Persians to the Grecians, always still allowed the Jews to conduct their own court civil judicial system. But a funny thing happened in 7 AD. Catch the date. Copernicus was appointed the procurator of Judea, and he took away from the Jews the right to administer capital punishment. And on that day, it's a very interesting thing that occurred, and it's recorded in the Babylonian Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud, which was a separate record. It's not the Bible, but it's a separate record. The high priest and all the other priests put on sackcloth and ashes on that day, and they marched around the city, and they wailed, because they believed that something incredible that should never have happened had happened, that the word of God had been broken, that they didn't think that was possible. But to them, the scepter had been removed, and Messiah had not come. That's impossible. How could that have happened? And yet they didn't realize that just a little bit up north, in a carpenter shop, was a young boy growing up, getting ready to step into the shoes and fulfill his destiny. But they were unaware. Why didn't they think to themselves, you know what? The scepter's been removed. Maybe the Messiah's around. But they didn't. They cried instead. Well, because they couldn't administer the death penalty, they had to bring Jesus to Pilate to complete this trial and get what they wanted. They told Pilate what they wanted. So they brought him up to the governor of Judea, who, by the way, was married to the granddaughter of Tiberius Caesar. So that's probably how he got appointed this position. Think of Judea as sort of the outermost areas of the Roman Empire, kind of the wild frontier where things are kind of going crazy, and they're just trying. All Caesar wants in Rome is collect some taxes, Pilate, and send the money back to me, and keep a lid on things. Don't let things get out of control. Keep the outlaws to a minimum. Be the military commander. That's your role. And just keep the peace, collect the money. That's what Pilate's job was. So when Pilate was there and Jesus was brought in, and they asked for permission to give him the death penalty, he starts to question Jesus about being king. And I noticed something when I was reading this last week. When Pilate asked him if he was king of the Jews, essentially asked him if he was Messiah, Jesus didn't give him the same answer that he gave the soldiers out in the garden, did he? Can you imagine if he had? Instead, Jesus is almost coy with him just a little bit. It is as you say. I wonder what would happen if he'd have said his eternal name, I am. But Pilate sends Jesus to Herod, who wants Jesus to do a miracle because he's heard about this Jesus guy up in Galilee. And Jesus doesn't even talk to Herod. Probably pretty upset at him for cutting John the Baptist's head off. Pilate proposes releasing Jesus because he finds no fault in him. Now, most people, in fact, there's a place somewhere, I can't remember where Pilate is actually considered a saint. There are those who give Pilate an awful lot of credit for believing that Jesus was innocent. And I used to kind of think that way myself, until I started looking into a little bit more history about this guy and some of the things that he did even after the death and resurrection of Jesus. He killed a lot of Jews for virtually no reason. He was a very violent man, and he had no real interest in finding the truth. In fact, when he had Jesus stripped down and had him scourged, by the way, a scourging, that's called a half-death in those days, a half-death, because it literally brought the person within just an inch of their life and what they would do to them. And we don't really know, honestly, whether he had 39 lashes, because this would have been a Roman scourging, not a Jewish scourging. So, but probably pretty bad. And I'm not going to go into all the details, everything that happens between him and Pilate, but it's clear that Pilate was not the character that we might have think he was, just because he did recognize that they didn't have enough evidence to really convict Jesus like they thought. And he had a problem, though. See, when he sent Jesus to Herod and he got him back, it was like Jesus was this hot potato that nobody wanted to deal with. But they knew that they had to keep the peace, so they didn't want to upset these ruling Jews. So they were trying to sort of accommodate. But everybody was trying to accommodate everybody except for really carrying out a proper trial. Pilate was cynical. He was skeptical. He was hard-headed. He was a pragmatist. He compromised for the sake of expediency. And when he asked Jesus what is truth, it was just a sarcastic brush-off. I put down that I think Pilate was an ancient postmodern. If any of you know what postmodernism believes? Postmodernists believe that truth, there either is no truth, or if there is truth, it can't be known or can't be found out. So there's no point. Of course, the obvious question you ask them is, well, is that point of view absolutely true? And what do they say? If they say yes, then they do believe in absolute truth. Well, Jesus comes back to Pilate. Pilate's afraid. He's cowardly. He already had been put on notice by Rome to quell the riots. He's under pressure. So what does he decide? He decides, maybe I can get the crowd on my side. And because there was a special thing that Pilate could do, he was thinking that maybe he might pull off a fast one with this whole Barabbas switcheroo. But one of the things we have to realize is that Pilate could have done a proper trial. He could have done an honest investigation of Jesus. Now, I'm going to ask you a question here in this slide, Pilate the judge. What would a real trial have been like with an attorney calling witnesses and presenting evidence for Jesus? What would that trial have looked like? Well, some years ago, I was teaching a high school class, and it was made up of half Christians and half non-Christians. And I took these high school students, and I asked them, if somebody showed up here today and claimed to be God, what would you ask them to do or ask them to say, and how would you evaluate it in order to test that person if they were in fact who they claimed to be? And I got a whiteboard out and I started writing down their answers. And it took a while because, the crowd was kind of like you guys, a little reserved, kind of doing things by the numbers. But after a while, they started to loosen up with me. And we started to get some answers. And I recorded those answers and developed the following list. They said that they would like to see that this person would have supernatural power and control over nature and natural forces. That there would be miraculous displays such as rearranging molecules with only a word. Miraculously creating something from nothing at all. They would like this person to heal illnesses such as blindness, shriveled limbs, and insanity. They want this person to have power over spiritual, demonic, and supernatural forces, and to have knowledge about things that are only known to those who were present at the time, showing omnipresence. A detailed knowledge of the future, which is spoken in advance, like prophecy. They wanted to see that person was able to do that and have omniscience. They wanted this person to have consistent character so that their lives did not contradict their own teachings on morality, and demonstrate an ability to be present anywhere and everywhere immediately. And they have wisdom unlike anyone that had ever lived before, and a fearless confidence of one who is in and has ultimate control. An explanatory yet mysterious truth that would be expected of divinity. And that's a tricky one, meaning that the things they said weren't necessarily things that wouldn't make sense, but they would have an otherworldliness to them. And obviously the power to raise the dead and to create life. Wow. I don't know about you, but that's a powerful list. Let me ask you a question. Does Jesus Christ fulfill that list? Let's look at the next slide. Yes, he does. Just read the Gospels, the eyewitnesses' accounts. And there are eyewitnesses to every one of these fulfilling things. That trial that Pilate held, he could have called the witnesses. He could have had his investigators go out like me and track them down. And I would have dragged Jairus and his daughter in there. And I'd have put them under oath. And I'd have got Zacchaeus. Who's the guy who rose from the dead? Lazarus. Oh man, I'd have had Lazarus there with his cloth and everything. There's my physical evidence. I'd have brought it all in until it was just overwhelming. And that's what we would have had. You know, one time I had a case, if I can just tell you about this. It was a murder case. I found this young man slumped in his car, and he had a bullet right here in the head. Close wound, wasn't contact, but it was real close contact. And it was a funny angle. And we knew the trunk was popped in the back, so we knew something was going on, and we were suspicious it was a drug ripoff. Well, two guys who had committed this crime ran from the scene with the gun. And I'll just tell you the story. Basically, the shooter was in the back seat, and the other guy that was involved was in the front seat, and he had set up a meeting. The front seat guy had set up a meeting with the back seat guy, and it was going to be a drug sale. And the back seat guy pulls out a gun, and he's holding it, and he's trying to rip the guy off. And the intent was just to get the money. But all of a sudden, the victim reached up and grabbed for the gun. And when he grabbed for the gun, it was jerked, and it went off, and it killed the guy. Well, when they ran, they left one fingerprint behind. And it was the shooter's fingerprint. So we got an ID on the guy. I tracked him down, and I arrested him. Unfortunately, I didn't know who the shooter was. And we had evidence that there were two guys in the vehicle. And so we had a problem at trial, because I never could find the other guy. I knew I had this guy, but I couldn't really prove he was the shooter, but we were stuck and we were going to trial. I needed another witness. I needed more information, more evidence for this story. I needed a star witness. You see, I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what a star witness is. A star witness is somebody who comes into the trial and he just turns everything upside down because he is so valuable. He is so potent. He has such key information. He changes everything. He makes the case. In this case, as we were going through the trial, I got a phone call from the sister of the kid who had been in the car, who knew where her brother was hiding, and she wanted him to turn himself in. He wouldn't do it. He was scared. But she convinced him to go with me. And so I went out and met this kid, took him in and brought him in, and he told me the story. I said, well, how do I know you didn't pull the trigger and not the guy that I had? And he says, well, when we ran, I never touched the gun. And I said, where's the gun? He says, well, we stashed it, or at least my buddy stashed it in the bushes. And we went back and we found the gun, and I found a print on the gun from the shooter. And so during the middle of this trial, this all happened pretty quickly. I come marching into this trial with the star witness and the gun. And it turned everything upside down. This guy was pretty confident. He thought he was going to get off for sure, but he didn't because the star witness was presented. Let me read you a quote. It's a quote of mine in a book I've been writing. The crux of the issue upon which everything else hangs is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, as he predicted he would, which was for the purpose of saving humanity, as well as demonstrating he speaks with authority about reality, then he quickly rises to the top as a superior source of truth. But if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then all of human history up until today contains only failed claims by those who were merely human sources of questionable information about what truly happens to us when we die. In fact, outside of Jesus, there is no one even remotely close to passing the test we are outlining. There are no valid second choices. But let's take a look real quick at those in case you think I'm lying. Because I think a lot of times pastors and preachers get up and say exactly what I've just said to you, but they don't take the time to do what I'm going to do right now. The next slide shows that there are no other equivalents. In Islam's Quran, Hindu's Veda, the Bhagavad Gita, the Book of Mormon, Nostradamus' Centuries, and occultic mediums, channelers, New Age spiritual guides, as far as I have been able to search using Wikipedia and books, I have never found any that have come close to passing the test that Jesus Christ passed. Now, there are those who want to say that Horus and Attis and Mithra are people from the distant past, like 3000 BC, who supposedly mythology is that they rose from the dead, but there's virtually no evidence substantiating these stories. They're just nothing but vague stories. Go to the next slide. When we search for a star witness for the truth, who Jesus is, there's no other viable option, because when we look at some of the popular religious leaders, we look at Moses and we see that Moses is validated to some degree. Obviously, Jesus even validates Moses as having received revelation information from God and miracles having been performed. But after Moses, there's very little testimonial evidence and physical evidence to support that Mahavira from Jainism, Zoroaster, Guru Nanak from Sikhism, Buddha from Buddhism, Dogen, who established Zen Buddhism in Japan, Lao from Taoism, Confucianism, shamans, witch doctors in all the spirit religions of South America and some in Africa. How about Marcus Garvey? He started Rastafarianism. And the Baha'ism faith started Baha'u'llah. Joseph Smith, the guy who started Hare Krishna. Jehovah's Witnesses, Mr. Russell, Reverend Sun Myung Moon. And then there are popular guys that are all over PBS these days, Wayne Dyer, Deepak Chopra, and the atheist, evolutionist Neil deGrasse Tyson, and of course Oprah Winfrey are New Age kind of promoters. None of these people can pass even a modicum of the test that I gave Jesus Christ. And yet millions of people listen to the words that come out of their mouth and base their definition of what reality is on what these people say. Why? Why do they do that? An agnostic professor condescendingly confronted a little girl who believed in Jesus. There are many throughout history who have claimed that they were God. How can you be sure he told the truth? Which one of these men can you believe? The girl responded without hesitation, I believe in the one who rose from the dead, with great confidence. A star witness for the truth. Let's play a little short video if you don't mind. Do you still have it up? It's just a couple of minutes long. I think it kind of summarizes this. Maybe you might like it.
A man fell in a hole. He fell in a hole and he couldn't get out. A traveler passed by. He told the man to meditate, to purify his mind, and when he reached nirvana, all suffering would cease. The man did as he was told, but he remained in the hole. Another man appeared. He explained that the hole didn't exist, and neither, in fact, did the man. It was all an illusion. The man who did not exist was still stuck in the hole that was not there. Another visitor arrived. He instructed the man to perform good deeds to improve his karma, and though he would still die in the hole, he might be reincarnated as something magnificent. Another man looked down from above. He taught the man to pray 5 times a day facing east and to follow 5 important tenets. If he was faithful, one day, perhaps, the divine would set him free. The man prayed as best he could, but he was losing strength, and in the hole he remained. Another man appeared. There was something different about him. He called down to the man in the hole and asked him if he wanted to be free. This man lowered himself into the earth, into the pit. He took hold of the man and dragged him into the light. And the man in the hole, who could not get himself out, was saved.
Getting these days until the right option comes along. Well, I'm going to start to wrap up here. If you guys will just give me a few more minutes. I do believe that there's somebody, I know a lot of you are those who believe in the story of Christ, but I really believe there's at least one person in this room who needs to hear this tonight. And I don't know exactly who that is, but I truly believe that. So I want to share just a couple more things. You see, when Pilate got to this point of frustration, he appealed to the crowd to get him off the hook. Because they had a special thing that they would do on the high feast day, is they would let one of the prisoners go. And so he gave the crowd a choice between a guy named Barabbas, we've heard the story, right, many of us, Barabbas and Jesus. And of course the religious leaders were pretty excited to stir up the crowd to get them to pick Jesus and yell, "Crucify him," and that they would take Barabbas instead. But there's not a lot of information about this undesirable rebel named Barabbas, but I want to explore it really quickly with you. We don't know that much about him, but he stood under the righteous condemnation of the law. He knew that the one who was to take his cross and take his place was innocent. He knew that Jesus Christ was for him a true substitute. And he knew that he had done nothing to merit going free while another took his place. Now think about Barabbas here. They are quite literally changing places, he and Jesus. And we tend to think that this is just some little historical story aside. No doubt the Holy Spirit was part of orchestrating exactly what's going on here to give us some insight. They're changing places. The murderer's bonds, curse, disgrace, and mortal agony were transferred to the righteous Jesus, while the liberty, innocence, and safety and well-being of the Nazarene became the lot of the murderer. You see what's going on here? They're completely and wholly changing places. Barabbas is installed with all the rights and privileges of Jesus Christ. He can go free. While Jesus entered upon all the infamy and horror of the rebel's position, he's going to be crucified. The most infamous form of death that they could contrive. The delinquent's guilt and cross became the lot of the just one, and all the civil rights and immunities of the latter are the property of the delinquent. They're literally changing places. And what's really amazing is, what does Barabbas mean? What does that name actually mean? In the original language, it means son of the father, or actually son of daddy. In essence, that's really who Jesus was. So here's the big question. Where are you and I? We're in Barabbas' shoes. Everything that was true of Barabbas is true of us. Isn't that an amazing analogy? Here, if you could go ahead and come on back up and we'll finish up. 2 quick stories for you and then I'll be done. Thanks for your patience. There's another character in the Bible that's often overlooked. And as I was studying this week, I thought it was interesting. All 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, contain the same story. A story that is kind of a sideline to the whole trial of Jesus, but it's all going on at the same time. Many of you have heard of it. It has to do with Peter, the very special disciple of Jesus. Peter was told by Jesus right before Jesus was nabbed that he would deny him 3 times before the cock had crowed. And one of those gospel stories tells that when that 3rd denial happened, Peter became distraught. And in that distraught emotion of that moment, he realizes that Jesus' head has turned and their eyes meet. I don't know about you, but when I think about that, and I think about some of the things in my life, and when my eyes would meet Jesus, how I would feel, it says that Peter went away and wept bitterly. Bitterly. Jesus goes on to be crucified horribly, as we'll learn more of tomorrow night. And then 3 days later, to rise from the dead. Meanwhile, Peter goes and is hanging out with the various disciples. And what I love is how this story ends. Because that could have been it for Peter. And if it had been like you and I with the shame, he could have hung back, right? But he had a passion. And I want you to think about Pilate and Peter and compare these two guys. One's a coward and afraid and a compromiser and looking for the convenient way out. And then you have Peter, who makes mistakes, who had fear. He did. But later he turned back and he wanted one thing and one thing only, and that was to see and speak to Jesus again. So one day they're out on the sea and they're fishing, and they see a guy on the shore who says, "Hey, put your net over on the other side." John looks up and says, "It's the Lord." And they're all getting their paddles and they're getting ready. I used to be a river guide. I know how that works. Everybody's scrambling. Let's paddle back. But Peter, he gets to the front of the boat and leaps off in his enthusiasm and starts swimming as fast as he can to the shore. And he gets there before the boat. And he climbs up on that shore, and Jesus has something to eat, some fellowship, and some food. And I wish I could be at that conversation. What did Peter and Jesus talk about at that moment? But there was renewal. There was life. And that kind of courage that went into a man who later in his life, when he was about to be crucified himself, said, "I'm not worthy to die like my Savior," and was crucified upside down. That's Peter. Now today we live in turbulent times, and we have a lot to be worried about. But we don't have to have a hopeless feeling because we know who our Savior is. I'm going to read you a quick story. Last story. This is in the book I've been writing about something that happened to me. It's a true story. The phone rang in the middle of the night, as it usually did on my weekends. Another call out from my sergeant, ending with the instructions to keep him informed and let me know if you need any help, as he drifted back to sleep. I splashed some hot water on my face and stumbled out the door. At least this death scene was close by, the house not far away from the scene of what arriving patrol officers described as gruesome, but probably just a suicide. It was the type of scene that caused even seasoned detectives to stand up and take notice. Even suicides require thorough investigation, but usually one detective can handle it. So I went solo that night. She was upstairs in the side bedroom that had been used to store large workout equipment, her body propped up against the wall with a large shotgun wedged against the heavy metal exercise machine. With the gun awkwardly pointed towards her, she obviously could not reach with her hand, so she had jammed her right toe inside the trigger housing in a delicately creative, final, brutal act of desperation. It is very unusual for a woman to commit suicide in such a violent way. In fact, and perhaps by accident, the gun was not loaded with normal bird or even buckshot, but rather a large, solid slug round of devastatingly destructive power. In her case, she really didn't need to be very precise with the placement of the gun barrel tip inside her mouth, but she tried. Little remained of her beautiful face, except the photos I couldn't help staring at on the walls. It was just a few hours before she was alive and walking around this now silent and empty house that I roamed around in. Rare and many suicides I went to, but in this case, next to her body, I discovered the last thoughts that she had recorded in a notebook. My daughter doesn't think that I should ever read this, but I do. She wrote, "I don't know who I am or why I'm here anymore. Why is life so hard? It doesn't seem like there are any good options for me. I know I made mistakes. I wish I could just go back and do it over again, but I can't. Some people told me I'm perfect because the universe and I are one and the same and we are beautiful. But I just feel so ugly. Who says what I am and what's true anyway? I've searched, but I can't find anything that makes sense. Everyone just has their own opinions, and I'm so tired of hearing from people who don't know any more than I do. It seems to me there's no use trying anymore. There's no reason. There's no future here, but just maybe there is on the other side. if you read this note, I hope I see you there. Hope. I need hope. But truth is, I don't really know. Who says what's out there? I wish I knew. I wish somebody could give me hope. But what have I got to lose? Anything is better than nothing. Goodbye, Janelle. What I would say to Janelle is that she should have kept going, kept investigating, kept asking, kept searching, because what she didn't realize was there was someone who could have told her what reality is really all about. There was someone who provided the proof and the evidence that could stand up in a court of law today. I found him. I wish I had met her before. I don't know if any of us are going to meet Janelle tomorrow or another Janelle, but we need to be prepared, to be bold, to say what needs to be said, to reach out as much as we can. If you're here tonight and you're that person, I think, that needed to hear some of these facts because you've been waffling, you've been kind of, maybe life hasn't gone perfect for you, but it hasn't been that bad. You need to know that God is calling you to live according to his revealing truth about reality. And he wants you to stand up and follow him. And when you make that decision to stand up, you come tell me, you come tell Pastor Chaz. Maybe you get baptized. I got a great hot tub in my backyard. Perfect for baptisms on any evening. Just let us know. Let's pray. Pastor. Lord, we just thank you for this evening together and this opening salvo in learning about what you accomplished for us in this rescue operation. And we just thank you that you didn't leave us without a strong testimony and much evidence to give us faith and hope in the future. Lord, I just pray for those who needed to hear this, to have their faith strengthened tonight, that you would be with them by the power of your Spirit. Lord, we just thank you, and we pray for these next following nights that we continue to learn and worship and celebrate you during this resurrection weekend. In Jesus' name.